Hello and welcome to the webinar on Release Management Secrets with Jenkins and Ant. And I'm joined today by Mary Jo Sminke and Will Genovese, senior developers from CF Web Tools. And my name is Michael Smith. I'm the CEO of TerraTech. And we're going to be looking today at how you can automate and make your life a lot simpler when it comes to doing builds of your software and moving files around to different servers. So we're going to start off with Will, and he is an expert on building using Jenkins. Among many other things, he's been doing ColdFusion for more than 14 years, I think. And he also does security analysis as well as other things. Hello, Will.
Hello, Michael. Hello, everyone. Do I have presentation mode yet?
You do. I am handing it over to you. There you go.
All right.
And I don't see your screen yet, but I'm sure it's going to be coming up real soon now. Oh, here we are, Release Management with Jenkins.
All right. Did we want to do or not for intros?
Yes, happy to do more about you. So
anyways,
do you want to tell more about you, or should I tell more about you?
I'll just run with my preso.
Let's do that.
All right. Hey, as Michael mentioned, my name is Will Genovese. I'm working with CF Web Tools. I've been doing ColdFusion programming for a long time, since around '98. I also do systems administration, server performance tuning, security work, pretty much all around problem solver. My blog is trunkful.com. Visit my blog. We're going to be covering Jenkins. A lot of people work with, managing releases somehow. You're FTPing your code, you're doing comparisons with Beyond Compare or side-by-side views of Windows Explorer or something. But you have to get your code from development to staging. You're using staging, right? Please, everyone's using staging. Then after you've tested it on staging, you have to get your code from wherever you're developing, and hopefully you're using a version control system, right? Everyone, version control. And then you're going from that to a production server after everything works. So the big giant 50,000-foot overview of the whole situation is you write code, you commit code, you put code on staging, you test and repeat until it works. Then you publish your code to production servers, and then you rinse and repeat. You're going to go on to your next build cycle. You're going to go on and do the next feature or the whatever. I've seen large numbers of presentations on Jenkins and continuous integration and software development lifecycle. They go into great detail about how to manage this process. None of them ever tell me how to make Jenkins work. How does Jenkins do what it does? What do I fill out? I'm not doing the high overview presentation today. I am going to give you how does Jenkins work? How do you create a build? How do you make it work? And then Mary Jo will take over on the intricacies of Ant scripting. She has become a rather high-end genius in that area. So from here, high-end view down to the nuts and bolts. Installing Jenkins on a computer, server, desktop, pick a location. If you're going to be working with Jenkins on a regular basis for one client or multiple clients, as we do at CF Web Tools, we have a dedicated server that has nothing but Jenkins on it. The install is super simple. You download the Windows version to put on your Windows server. You double-click on the installer. You sit back. I think you have to click Next once, and after a few minutes, it loads up your browser window with Jenkins running. Jenkins runs as a service, and it's there. It's running. It's sitting there in front of you going, okay, now what? Now you need to install plugins. Oh, wait, most of the needed plugins are already pre-installed. It comes with FTP, SVN, CSV, Ant, a credentials module, SSH credentials, and a few other things, you will have to install your own Git plugins. However, Jenkins Plugins Manager makes that super simple. You go to Manage Your Jenkins, you go into Available Plugins, and you search for Git, and you start, click on the one you want to install, and it's installed. Create a build project. This is where the learning curve goes vertical. Everyone can install Jenkins, everyone can get your plugins, and there's a whole lot of no information on creating a build project. What do I do? How does this work? There's an Ant script, but I don't know where to start with this Ant script because I don't have a template. There's nothing to begin with. I have those for you. We built those here at CF Web Tools that everyone here uses. I can get you a copy later, after the presentation, of the build script template, because most people just don't know where to go from, all right, I have this beautiful Jenkins server, to building a project. So then you're learning how to write Ant scripts gets even more complex for some people. And then there's more to just figure out. So we're not going to go into any more of slides. We're just going to do a demo.
And just before we start the demo, Will, I just kind of curious if anyone on the webinar already uses Jenkins, and if so, what your experience level is. So if you can just check off what your experience level is, and we'll go ahead and close the poll in 3, 2, 1, and let's just see that, well, looks like 2/3 of people have never used Jenkins, and some people have used it at some extent and intermediate, and the only expert on the call is you, Will. So that just to help give you some idea of the level of detail to go into.
Well, that will help because 2/3 of the people have never done a build script or created a build with Jenkins. You're here because you want to learn how, not you want to be told why you should be using Jenkins, but you want to learn how to use Jenkins. So we're going to go into doing a demo setup. So let me swap screens here. I'm going to, nope, cancel. Okay, am I still on here? Yes. I'm going to pause showing my screen for a second, switch over to my Windows side, and show my Windows screen. I believe everyone can see that.
Yep, looks good.
Okay. What I have here is I'm showing just a quick Jenkins on my dev VM that I put in place last night, mainly because I don't want to interfere with the production variant that we have running at CF Web Tools. So what we're going to do here is start with Jenkins. This is a very raw install of Jenkins. I'm going to click on a new item, and I'm going to say we're going to build something new. Now, ColdFusion development isn't like other types of development processes where you have compiled code or anything else. So you're not going to be running any sort of compiler, not doing Maven or anything else. We're just going to do what's called a freestyle software project. And we're going to give it a name. The name is something that means something to you. So I'm just going to say CFMon staging. CFMon is short for CF Monitor, which is the CF monitoring tools I've written here at CF Web Tools. And I have them in a version control so I can go through this build process and kind of give you an idea of how to set it up with an actual version control system. So click OK. The next thing we're going to get into is this page of, I don't even know what some of these options are. For most people are going to go, I don't know what these options are. I'm not sure what I'm doing. And the thing is, the critical things you need, the items you want to know about, are hidden under the button Advanced. They're not any other options. They're just in here. So what you want in here is you're going to use a custom workspace, which brings me to what is a workspace in Jenkins. A workspace in Jenkins is a folder that you've dedicated on the Jenkins server called anything you want it. It's just a place where all your build files are going to go and all your source code is going to check out to. And so I have a builds folder. I have CFMon as my project. Then I have a staging, and then a folder called staging. Inside that I have build, and inside that I have source, and then I have my build XML file. Build and source are currently empty. Build will hold eventually cache files that Jenkins will put in place when it publishes your code, saying it puts a cache in there just so Jenkins can keep track of which files it's published in the past. Source will be your SVN or Git checkout. That's where your code's going to go. You're not going to have to work with the file system once you have your build functioning. You need to work with the file system in the first place just to get your build working. So we're going to edit your build script. And like I said, there wasn't a default template anywhere that we found. We built and created our own default templates here. So what we'll do is you have a project, you have project name, you give it a name. I entered CFMon already. I pre-edited this one earlier today. So then you have to worry about various properties and descriptions and locations. We're going to sit here and go fill in the blanks on our deploy script and just simply say the deploy directory. This is where I am going to publish my code, in this case where I'm going to publish the code via just plain old file copy. You can do FTP and other methods with Jenkins, but right now for this brief presentation I'm going to show you just a file copy. So we're going to do a site location is what you do here. So my folder is C, INetPub, WebRoot, clients, and CFMon. When Jenkins gets done doing the build, it will actually copy the files it needs from the checkout into here. Most of these other things in here you're not going to worry about because this is things that just needed to make this script work. And now we have targets. Targets we'll come back to later, and Mary Jo will go over targets a lot. But we have a deploy and a deploy all target, and those call two different targets. One is copy all, and copy all includes all CFM, it includes all CFCs, but it excludes application CFC and it excludes application CFM. It excludes backup. So if you have things that are in your source control that you don't want to publish every single time or copy every single time, you get to sit in here and choose, I want to exclude backup files. I want to include JPEGs, or maybe I want to exclude JPEGs. I have one client that has about 5 gigs of video files. I don't want to push that every time I publish their code, so I use an exclude statement and just say exclude all MP4s, I think it was. So that there's options you have to control what you want to do, and you can create more than one target, so you can have one that does a copy all, and then I have one here below that on our default is copy all with, or copy with app. And that means in this particular case for us it's going to copy with the CFC and CFMs, but it's not going to exclude application CFC or exclude application CFM. In most of our builds, we don't always want to keep pushing the application CFC or the application CFM because it's more of a critical file than some of the others. So that's kind of real quick an Ant script. And I'm not going to go into great details in the Ant script because that's Mary Jo's part of the presentation. So what I need to do in my Jenkins build is say, where is my workspace? Workspace meaning where is your version control files, where are your version control files going to be checked out? And since I did this earlier, I'll come over here and say source. Please confirm it, stay on page here. So source. If I did something, like this, why is chance. Okay. Sometimes it will just automatically check and say that file location doesn't exist. It's not doing that for the moment. I'm not sure why. Next thing you want to worry about, so that's your advanced options for determining where your source is going to go. And like I said before, you have your CFMON, staging, and source in your build location. Now I'm going to choose a version control system. Jenkins comes pre-installed with CFS and subversion. You can add Git. So here it pre-check says yes, a repository URL is needed. So I'm going to type in a URL and go to the next thing here. And the reason why it just accepted and say we're all good is because I previously entered my credentials into here, and it remembers my credentials for this location. So if I were to come over here and say svn.cfwebtools.com and say, let's type this right. And say CF let's see what it does at this point. Unable to access, show details. Maybe you need to enter credentials. The first time you're entering a SVN location or a Git location, it's going to try and authenticate. And so it's going to go in here and go, well, I can't do that because you haven't entered credentials. So you click on Enter Credentials. And I'm going to say, in this case, I'm going to enter a credentials and see if I remember what my version control credentials are. Authentication was successful. That means I remember what they were. And momentarily, there it goes. It has re-verified and checked and said, hey, we're good. Now you can check out your code from your version control system. So now you know this portion of the Jenkins build will work because it actually knows that that's correct. And so if I'm going to follow proper version control procedure, I would check out from, say, the trunk. The next thing you go through here, and as you go through the rest of the page here, you see checkout strategy, report, things you're not really sure about, things you don't really need to worry about unless you're going to do, say, automated triggers, which we can do. We can say build after other projects are built, build periodically, pull, but we don't have the plugin turned in. It looks like, at least I don't have it enabled here. I'll show it to you when I go onto the production side. But we don't have the plugin turned in for, or installed here for triggering from a SVN post-commit hook, which is what we do here at CF Web Tools. We do that a lot. But we're going to add a build step here, and we're going to say invoke Ant, and we're going to say, what's my Ant target? My target, remember from the Ant scripts, was deploy all, or deploy. So there's my Ant target. I'm going to say deploy all, if I can type. But deploy all, and you would think you're done, but again, the things that you really need to know about are hidden under the advanced button. And the thing you really need to tell Jenkins is where your build file's at. So our build file is at C builds CFMON staging build.xml. And that is the basics. That is the bare bone basics setting up a Java build or a Jenkins build. So I just click applied, we're saved, and this is essentially what a Jenkins build will look like internally here. There's a good chance this won't run because I don't believe I have a couple of the plugins I need installed. Let me just double check here. I'm going to come up here, and if I just say build now, it will do a build, and I can click on the build right here, and I click on console output right here, and you get to see what's going on live as it happens. And you see right here, it did the version control checkout, which is great. You get to see where it happened, and you get to see there's something wrong with my Ant script that did not finish. I guess said I was not going to actually make it work on my local machine because there were a couple things I don't have set up here. So come back out of this and come back over to my presentation window on this side, and you can see I have this monitor, the same Ant script or the same build set up in our production Jenkins server here at CF Web Tools, and you'll see pretty much the same thing here. In the advanced options, I have my source for the CF monitor, staging source. You'll see here I'm using version control, where it's located. You'll see here I'm having build triggers. I have trigger, builds remotely. This is a plugin that I didn't have installed on my dev. Basically, I have a post-commit SVN hook that calls Jenkins via a URL, it passes it some information, and Jenkins goes, okay, I'm going to run this build. So every time you commit to staging, you actually get a staging build. We don't do that for production. Productions are always run manually. So let's scroll down a little bit further here, and you'll see build is your Ant again. You'll see my build file is build staging. And there really isn't much else here. That is what we've done here. And the build file here, the only difference in this build file versus the other one is the target locations of where we're going to actually put code. So if I were to say build here, it's going to trigger a build, and you'll see it load here shortly. And it takes a little bit longer on our production Jenkins server because we have so much running over here. But it should start in a moment here. I don't know if we have a large build running at the moment on Jenkins. If we do, this could take a little bit longer. Let's see real quick. We'll have a large build running.
I think you showed me earlier, Will, that you
All right,
have
there we
like
go.
oh, there it is. There's also like an overview
Yeah.
page that shows all the builds and
Right.
the status, which might be good to see just as we wrap up before we hand over to Mary Jo.
All right. So in here you'll see it did the build. There was no change from our version control. Deploy all, copy, build successful. And basically it did a build file and it copied the build file, copied the files to the proper location on our staging server. I'll give this a brief look here. Here is your Jenkins overview front page for a server that has a large number of Jenkins builds. I have 50, I don't even know how many builds I have total, or how many projects we have. But scroll down here and you can get a kind of overview health of everything. But the overall health isn't really relevant to us because every build is for a different client. So the overall health is, I want to know about one client. But basically you get to go here and see everything you have. And that is a very quick rundown on creating a build with Jenkins. Let's see here. So back to here. Here's a recap. Basically, you create your build files, folders and files in your Jenkins server. You build a freestyle software project. You configure the following steps, and then you go into Ant scripting. And that's where Mary Jo takes over.
Great. Well, thanks, Will. We did have one question that would be useful to say now. Jenkins is basically a job monitoring server-side program, or is there something else that we're not getting here?
Well, Jenkins is it's Java-based, so it's a Java web client, or it works in a J2EE container. And Jenkins it does monitor per se, build, and it executes, in this case, in our case at least, it's used to execute Ant scripts, and the Ant scripts do the vast majority of the work. So yeah, in a way, Jenkins is the controller slash monitor of the build system.
Okay, and we've got someone who's saying, Damon, who's saying that, like you've shown, it can run Ant, or also it can export from source control, copy files around, even run URLs.
Yes.
And someone else is saying I must be breathing heavily into my microphone, so I'll try and not do that and mute myself when not.
Okay.
Anyway, let me go ahead and change presenters to Mary Jo and make sure her screen comes up. And then I do have while we're waiting for her screen to come up, I do want to ask people off the bat what your Ant experience is, because that'll probably affect the level of detail that Mary Jo goes into. So let me put that poll up, and if you can fill out what your Ant experience is, whether it's none, some, intermediate, or expert. And I'll go ahead and close the poll in 3, 2, 1. And, well, looks like the majority of people have none, but we've got a significant number of folks who've got some or intermediate, and also got some experts on the call as well. So, Mary Jo, let's have a look at Ant. Are you there, Mary Jo? I hear lots of noise, but no
Yeah, I'm
voice.
sorry. I can only control my environment so much, so somebody's running the ice maker in the background.
Oh, my.
Sorry about that. Okay, so we're going to talk a bit about doing Ant builds in Jenkins, or in other ways that you can use Ant. And just kind of to give you an overview of where I come from this. When I started working with CF Web Tools, I came on to a project with a fairly large client that we had both development and staging environments as well as production. And our production server is a 2-server cluster that we have trusted cache on. So whenever we were doing production builds, we had to clear the trusted cache and FTP all the files. We don't host the servers, so we have to FTP everything to the servers and clear out the cache. And we also, on the development servers, their designers do a lot of their testing on these development servers. And so we'd run into issues like any number of our developers checking in a change to the application.cfc file and then breaking the development server as a result. So, and then the production builds taking like a half hour of our time whenever we had to, do all this manual uploading and clearing cache and logging onto the servers, which are remote, so have to be accessed through our own server on the VPN. So I basically don't really consider myself an Ant expert so much as just I'm a lazy developer that gets tired of doing things over and over again. So I was basically digging into Ant and what I could possibly do with Ant to make my job easier, and just kept adding more and more stuff into these builds to the point that it's now a completely automatic process for all of these different servers, and all we need to do is trigger the build in the Jenkins server, and then I don't have to do anything else. So let's take a look at how Ant was able to do this. So again, to run down some of the various challenges that we had with the build process, I do a lot of configuring in application.cfc, and then we also have a lot of rewrite rules in an htaccess file for our servers. And in these two files, we've got some settings that are dependent on the server, and since then I've got a couple other files as well where we sometimes have to change a variable. Basically, some of our JavaScript files for external services need changes, like a PayPal. You might have a PayPal token, one that's for the sandbox, one that's for the live server that you need to change according to whether you're on development or staging. So I don't want to have to change them every time I'm moving files. So we want to be able to change those settings according to where we're building. And then again, it's an external third-party host, so we're going to be doing FTP. Our production server is a load balance cluster of 2 servers, so we got to deal with a sorted number of issues related to that. And after we build, we want to be able to reinitialize the site, reload anything that's stored in application variables, cache data, cache queries, cache, pretty much anything that we might have. We don't currently use anything like Cold Spring, but that would be something else that you might need to reinitialize. Okay, we have trusted cache, as I mentioned, so we need to clear that trusted cache. For those of you that aren't familiar with trusted cache, it's basically a setting that is very typically used for production servers that tells ColdFusion after you've read in a CFM or CFC page and cache that, you don't need to read it again. It's going to just cache that. And so if you upload changes to your files, you have to go into the CF administrator and click the little button that says clear that trusted cache. So we wanted to find a way to automate that process after all our build process was completed. And with this particular client, we have a lot of files. We exclude, it's an e-commerce website. We exclude all the product images from the build, but even doing that, it's a lot of files. And when we've got to build to 2 different servers, those builds would take up to 2 hours to complete. So I wanted to find a way that I could shorten the process of building as well. And then my client always wants to know, when is it done? When is it done? So, I didn't want to have to, if I start a build process at, 11 o'clock at night, I didn't want to have to sit there and babysit it and wait to see when it was completed so that I could email my client who's on the West Coast 3 hours behind me. So a lot of times I'm running these builds fairly late at night on my East Coast, and he needs to know when it's completed so that he can go in and check the site. So I wanted to find a way to automate that as well. So first of all, for those of you that are not familiar with Ant, what exactly is it? It's basically just a general purpose build tool. It's Apache open source. There's some debate about where the name comes from, but the guy that wrote it says it stands for another neat tool, but some people also think of it as in terms of ants doing, repetitive tasks, just, trotting along doing their little repetitive tasks. It was primarily developed to build and deploy Java projects, but it's basically been extended to pretty much do all kinds of stuff, and there's all sorts of plugins you can get for Ant. And Eclipse or CF Builder, if you use CF Builder, does include an Ant view that can be used to view and run Ant processes, and I'll just show you that over in CF Builder. So here's my Ant view. Now it does depend a little bit on if you are running like CF Eclipse and you installed Eclipse, which build of Eclipse that you have. Not all of them do include the Ant build, so you have to be sure to use an Eclipse build that does include Ant. But basically it'll give you proper color coding syntax of your Ant build file, and then it gives you this nice little Ant build where you can go to any of your targets and tell it to run that target. So I could tell it to run my Ant build, debug, and a lot of these relate mostly to some Java builds, but this is a way a lot of people get started with Ant and doing some simple Ant processes. And in fact, this was how I first used Ant. We did not have a build server. We just set up our Ant processes directly in CF Builder and then just triggered them from here in terms of doing things like replacing information in our application.cfc and copying from one server to another. So this is a very simple way to get started with Ant, or if you want to automate any processes on your local machine, it's another nice use of this particular Okay, so first of all, let's talk about handling our application settings. So what we do in our projects is our application.cfc is going to have an application.environment setting. So when I check the code into SVN, it's always going to have application.environment equals local, which is, we're doing a local testing and development. And then when I run a development build, it's going to replace that variable with dev. When it runs a staging build, it's going to replace that variable with staging. And then on production, it'll replace it with prod or production or whatever you want to use. So that's the first thing that I need my Ant to do. So we're going to use an Ant replace action to find and replace that setting whenever we do these builds to each of these servers. And you could basically use a similar replace action for any other settings. Typically the ones that we have are settings for our data source, and email settings that we might want to be different for local dev, staging, and production. Error handling, I often like to turn off a global error handler or an application-wide error handler on local so that I can see all my ColdFusion debug information directly, whereas on the servers, I'm generally using an error handler that's going to present a user-friendly page. And then URL settings that might be specific to the server. And then likewise, htaccess, robots.txt, or some other files that I typically do replace actions on. And then, as I mentioned, I might have other files that I need to replace settings in according to what that application is doing. So let's take a look at these. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these replace actions in our file here. And I'm going to go ahead and close out this here. Okay, so here's typically what I might have in my, I'm going to jump over my text and use this file instead. Okay. Okay, so in my application.cfc, here's the action that I'm using. It's just a simple replace. You can do regular expression replaces as well in Ant. Typically, I don't need to do that. I'm just doing a pretty simple replace. So in this case, in my application.cfc, I'm looking for my local server and replacing it with my production server address. And I have another setting for the secure URL, which typically is just an HTTP on local or on dev. And then when I go to production, I need to change that to an HTTPS. And then this is a data source setting. This is that environmental setting. We also use a CDN, a content delivery network, for our images. So we have replaces for those so that locally we're not using the CDN, but on production we are. So you can see how I'm doing just a lot of different replaces in here. And then in my htaccess file, I have basically some lines that are commented out locally, and then I want to uncomment them when I go to production. Same thing on robots.txt. I usually have some lines that are commented out, and then when I go to production, I want to go ahead and turn them on. That's basically what most of these are. And then, as I mentioned, I might have some other files where I might want to change a setting from dev to live or sandbox to production or anything like that. So if I take a look at my application.cfc page, find it. Oops. Here's some of these settings. So here's my session.url. This is what it was looking for and would do a replace for when I go to production. Sorry, it's actually this one, application.url. So I would be looking for this and replacing when I go to production. Now, one thing we do have to enforce in our development process is that everybody uses the same local name for their development, so that everybody, when they check in changes to application.cfc, does not have a different local address in here that when I go to do those builds, it might have trouble finding and replacing that. So let's stop there. Any questions so far? I don't see any questions, so we're doing good. And let's go back to the slideshow. Oops. Sorry, jumped ahead here. Okay. So some caveats on doing these replace actions. All right, we're checking out from SVN, local files have changes. So this is very important when you're doing these kinds of replace actions. Let's go into Jenkins here, and we're going to go into the configure. In your source code management here, you have a checkout strategy, and the default is to use SVN update as much as possible. If you do any replace actions, it's very important to note that if you only do an SVN update, you can end up with conflicts in any of the files that you're replacing. So it's very important to do this setting. Use SVN update as much as possible with a revert before update. So this will revert out those changes that Ant did before Jenkins checks out your files. Or you can always check out a fresh copy, which I often use on my production builds, as I've sometimes had problems with the update always picking up everything. So let's go back here. And then all users, as I mentioned, will need to use the same address for their local copies. And then test. When you're doing some of these replace actions, you want to make really sure that your replace actions are not replacing things you don't expect them to. So when you make any changes to your Ant builds, you want to make sure, particularly with your production builds, that you go in and actually look at the file after it does its replace to make sure that what you're getting is what you expect for it to get. And there have definitely been times where I've made a very small tweak to those replace actions, and then boom, it found an additional line in the file that I wasn't expecting it to find. So I have to make really sure to look for those. Okay, so let's go on to FTP. Ant does support FTP actions. However, it does not support secure FTP, at least up to the last time I checked. So what we do, we use FileZilla on our server. So what we've had to do is we configure FileZilla for other user accounts to require secure FTP, and then we restrict the account that's used for our builds by IP address, so that only the Jenkins build server has access to that account, which is not secured. And then due to our clustered server, we have to copy the files to 2 different FTP targets. We do have file replication in place on these servers, but because we need to clear trusted cache, and we do that as part of the build, we just can't rely on that file replication to happen in time for that process to happen. So let's go back to our build here. Okay. Now, one thing that I do here is I do what's called a pattern set, and I tell it which files I'm going to include, which files I'm going to exclude. And my builds, I'll talk about this a little bit later. I have a number of different ones here, but this is basically all the files that I'm including, and then I have some excludes. The way that these includes and excludes work is once you exclude something, you cannot go back and include a subset of it. So you always have to kind of do your includes first, and then if I want to exclude something that might otherwise be included, I do that last. So in this case, I have this particular directory of testing, which is where all my MX unit tests and Selenium tests are. I want to exclude that on my production build. I don't need to move those to production. So those files might otherwise be included based on these extensions that I'm including. And then I do various file sets, which basically are what are the files that I want to move. And I basically have a number of different ones set up here. But we'll take a look at this, the common one, which is just these pattern sets of the include and then the exclude. So again, what I'm doing here is setting up some common groupings. Some common groupings that I'm going to use in my targets. And again, these are all these directories that I don't need to typically move when I want to do these builds.
So we're going to be doing Q&A in 5 minutes, just to let you know where we are on time. And those of you on the call, if you go to the questions widget on the right-hand side, you can put your questions in for Mary Jo or Will on either Jenkins or Ant. So go ahead, Mary Jo.
Okay, I'm going to move on then because the FTP stuff is fairly easy to figure out, and not everybody needs to know that. And I think this other information will be a little bit more useful for you. But if anybody after the presentation wants more information on the FTP, feel free to hit me up, and I can certainly give you more information on how you would run some FTP processes. But basically, what I do, because we have such a large number of files, is in this thing what I'm doing is I'm setting up different targets. So I have common, I have with my admin directory, with my lib directory, with all my images. And so basically what this include exclude here is doing is it's setting up all my most common files that I need, and then I'm excluding a bunch of directories that don't get changed very often. So a lot of these directories have not changed in like a couple years, so I don't need to include them on most of my builds. And then what I'm doing is I'm setting up some different targets so that if I want to, for instance, include my admin directory, I set up a different target for that. My lib directory, like CK editor, oh my gosh, there are so many files in CK editor, so I don't need to move that on every single build. And then when I go into Jenkins, over in Jenkins here, there's a place here where you tell it the target to run. So in this case, I'm telling it to deploy the target that includes all my images instead of just the common images. Okay, so to go on, so let's talk about clearing trusted cache. This uses the CFadmin API, which is, I forget which version of ColdFusion it's available since, but certainly since 9. The important thing to know when you use this, you want to make sure that you're really protecting the directory you're running this from. So we use htaccess to specifically only allow the Jenkins server to access the file that runs this. And of course, your CFadmin should always be fully locked down. You may not be able to use this if you're on a shared server, since a lot of hosting companies will exclude it. And I also separate out my scripts directory when I clear the trusted cache, or in my build. What I do is I run all the ColdFusion files first, I clear trusted cache, then I move the scripts, because we do a lot of AJAX calls, and I don't want to call any new or changed files in the scripts until this has been moved. But typically I'm going to turn off the site if I'm doing a large build that includes a lot of those file changes. So we'll just take a quick look. Oh, actually, I think I have it right here. Oh, here we go. Okay, so here's how you would call it. You just create this component, the CFID admin API administrator. You put in the login for your CF administrator, and then you're going to create the runtime object, and then call. This is going to clear trusted cache, and this is going to clear component cache. We use both of those. Now, you may be using other types of caching. We use an initialization method in our application.cfc that looks like this. @var init, which is down in here. So we call @var init right here, which sets up all our application variables, brings all our components into application scope, sets up some third-party services. So we're going to, we have a variable that we call on the URL that will tell on any request to run this reinit sequence.
Great.
And
So
we only want to reset after we clear the trusted cache.
great. So we had several people asking, how do you automate your testing? You see it, unit tests or Selenium seems to be a question. And someone else also asking, are we going to provide the slides afterwards? And the answer is yes. And I know you have a lot more info on the slides than perhaps we have time for before we go on to the Q&A. So just want to do those two things.
Here we go. Since you're asking about the MX unit test, actually there's a really nice amount of information at the MX unit site, which tells you specifically how to automate your unit tests. So you're going to have to set up some properties which define where all of these, where your MX unit files are, where you want to put your test results, what type of style you want to use, and then you just create a target that looks something like this. I call it run tests. and then it uses this class name, and then again you're going to use the variable to where the class path is, and then what server the files are on, where you define this output directory, and then the path to the directory and the component path. And then this will just run the MX unit tests, and I can quickly show you. I just did one of these, and so we can take a look at what that looks like. The other thing while I'm pulling that up that I didn't get to was emailing the client. And actually what I do, there is an email plugin that you can get for Jenkins. The really frustrating thing about this is that it does not email on success. It only emails if your build fails. And you can kind of configure who you want it to email, and then it'll also email you if after a failure it comes back to being successful. Is this the right one? No, that's not the right one. So what I had to do was find out a different way that I could email the client. So that is also part of the clearing cache process. So if I go in here real quickly, we'll pull this clear cache file up. So one thing I do is I pass in the build number and build name on the URL that calls this file at the end of the build process. Here's the clearing the trusted cache, and then here's my email, where I just fire off an email at the end of this clear caches.cfm page, and that'll email out to whatever, whoever you want to notify. It'll include the build number, and it'll include, in this case, the server name that build ran on.
That's great, Mary Jo. So, got someone asking about MX Unit. Do you run that locally, or does it have to be on the Jenkins box or the Ant box?
No. In fact, it's not on the Ant box at all. Again, when you go into slides here, right here, when you define the server, this is basically the server that you've got your MX unit files on. And then you can also, I generally am running my MX unit tests separately, just because I don't currently run them every time we do builds. But you actually can run this fail action and say, okay, if the test failed, what do I want to do? A lot of time, if you put a fail in anywhere in a target, it'll basically stop at that point. So I can say, okay, I'm running a production build. I'm going to run the MX unit tasks, and if the tests fail, and notice I have a failure property here, test failed, and then if that test fails, I don't want to continue on with my production build. So I can be running these tests on a staging server as part of the production build, and then failing it and not continuing with the production build if anything went wrong with the MX unit test. And if you use Selenium, you can do the same thing with Selenium. There are also similar Ant processes for running Selenium tests as part of the builds.
And does this work with other things like TestBox?
I would assume so. I don't use TestBox currently. They basically would have to have some kind of jar or JUnit process that would work with Ant. Basically, Ant will handle any kind of JUnit output and consider that part of the process. And in fact, you can even just configure it separately.
Okay. And John is asking about the search and replace. Well, sounds like you've got some dogs in the background.
If somebody rings the doorbell, that is the one thing I cannot control during presentation.
There you go. So asking about the search and replace, is it possible to log what gets searched and replaced for debugging purposes?
That's a good question. Hey! Sorry about that. I don't think so. There's certainly logging available in Ant, but in terms of logging what's there, what you can do is you can log the completed file. So that might be appropriate, or certainly as part of our build process, we're running. I'm basically down here in my file. I have to read in here here's the gets that basically call these URLs. And as part of that build process, you can log those files. You can see here that I'm putting the destination here so that these I'm creating these files when I do that get. So if someone goes along, and can go in and take a look at those and see, or in my case, I've got an application-wide error handler. So if something goes wrong with that init process, it's going to email me and let me know that there's something wrong in there.
Great. So Damon's mentioning you talked about email on failure. Damon's mentioning there's a Jenkins plugin that will email on success as well. So if that's important to you.
Oh, is there? I hadn't been able to find one. That would certainly be really nice. I hadn't found that one. The one we have in here explains that it runs as a post-build action, and it basically sends, and you can say send an email for every unstable build. If that's unchecked, it'll only send the email the first time a build becomes unstable. And then again, it'll send an email once it becomes stable again.
Great.
I know that Jenkins also has a publish to FTP action in here that you also can use. Do your FTPing. You can also publish your JUnit test results. So there's a number of other things that are here in Jenkins as post-build actions that you can use. I haven't really played around with this because with the FTP, again, since I have to run other processes in the build, this by itself is not good enough for me. But if you don't need to do any of this replace or clear cache or anything like that, if you're just needing to FTP to a server, this might work just fine for you versus doing it. But Ant just gives you so much more control over what you're doing, what files you're pushing, and what actions you're running after the processes.
And got someone who when they update their Java version, Ant and Jenkins are not happy. I don't know if you've had any experience with that, or if Will wants to chime in on that.
I haven't had an issue with that happening before. I believe like most Java applications, there is a config file for Jenkins that you can point to which JRE you're going to use. I would just double check to make sure you're using the JRE that you want to use, or that it has the correct locations in there. But I have not seen an issue with upgrading the Java version causing an issue with Jenkins.
Yeah, I mean, Chris is saying that his build will stop running even though he can run them manually. Maybe there's a version of Java inside Jenkins, or
well, Jenkins installs its own JRE in its own location that it uses, and then there's a config file that it will use to say use this JRE and not the system Java. So I've never seen an issue where it actually interferes with the system Java.
That's great. John is asking, are there any books good for learning Ant? And I'm going to ask the same question about Jenkins. So, Mary Jo, any book you really like on Ant? And I don't know if Mary Jo is still there, or maybe she... But I've certainly found a book by Steve Holtzner called Ant, the Definitive Guide, which looks very big, about 600 pages. I don't know if you have any other suggestions, Will.
I actually don't do the books really anymore. I just go to Jenkins wiki. Jenkins website has a wiki. There's other things like that.
Okay.
Relatively good, useful, up-to-date resources that aren't going to go stale after 6 months.
Right. And Damon's mentioning the O'Reilly book on Ant, which I think is the one I mentioned. So thanks for that. And then what about Selenium tests? Do you need a separate server to run those on? Or do you just run it on the same box as Ant or Jenkins?
Well, I personally haven't run the Selenium test from Ant yet. I'm not sure if it runs on the same server or a different one. from my knowledge of Selenium, it definitely needs to run on Selenium RC, and I would assume you can again run it on any server, but I don't know for sure.
Okay, I've got.
Yeah, the book I have, Michael's the same one that you have, and I certainly would recommend the book because in the case of Ant, there really haven't been a whole lot of changes to it. So that information's not getting out of it's not tending to be updating as much as Jenkins currently is. And there's just so much else you can do with Ant. For instance, you can run Windows processes as well from it. So there's some really cool stuff out there that people do with Ant.
I'm kind of curious if people use anything other than Ant, because I remember a long time ago I used to use Make for this kind of thing, and there's also Maven and Gradle. So if folks just want to respond as to what tools they use, that might be interesting to everyone to see what is there. So I'll close the survey in 3, 2, 1, and well, not surprising, Ant is number 1. But there are some folks using Maven, and there's some people using some other tools as well. So that is interesting. So I think we've got time for 1 or 2 more questions, and then we need to conclude the webinar. Got someone asking, do you use Jenkins for PhoneGap development? That's the thing that's integrated with CF11. So I don't know if Will or Mary Jo, you do that?
I know we have one client who is pre-building on ColdFusion 11 beta and the ColdFusion Builder beta a mobile app. We have not integrated them into Jenkins yet because they're doing their own separate side project and they're coordinated with Adobe on that. But yeah, I will figure out a way of bringing that into this, or at least I'll try. I haven't seen it done yet.
And someone asking, can you only use Ant with Jenkins, or can you run other scripts like Bash or anything else you have?
It will do Maven, I believe. There are hundreds or maybe thousands of Jenkins. When you go over to Manage Jenkins, you'll see a spot for choosing plugins. You can click on the tab for available plugins, and there are thousands. Just start searching for what you want to use, and there's probably something available.
Great. So I think that's... well, someone else is mentioning there's other continuous integration servers, Bamboo, so all kinds of things. And John is mentioning there are over 600 plugins for Jenkins, which is pretty amazing.
Okay.
So
Bamboo is an excellent integration server as well. Just keep in mind that it's not necessarily free, so that's why Jenkins is becoming so popular. And I don't know if we'll mention, but if you hear people refer to Hudson, that's basically Jenkins.
right, that was the previous name for Jenkins. I don't know quite why they changed the name, but maybe they had a conflict or something.
There was a copyright issue, or someone took something Hudson commercial or something.
Great. Well, we'll be providing the slides, and I think Will said you had a example file you were going to provide folks. So if you get that to me, I'll get that out to everyone, and I'll send an email by tomorrow with the resources. And we did record this webinar, so I'll put the recording out as well. So thanks so much, Mary Jo and Will, and thanks everyone for attending. The next webinar will be on the next second Tuesday of the month, which is the 8th of April, and we'll look forward to seeing people there. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your Tuesday.